It's a treat for me to begin with a conversation with two of the universities and the world's leading thinkers on globalization. Two of my colleagues at the business school and in the economics community at Columbia. The first is Joseph Stiglitz, who's a Nobel Laureate in economics and a university professor at Columbia, a giant in virtually every field in economics, but here in particular in information economics and public economics. He's also joined by Bruce Greenwald, who is the Heilbrunn Professor of Asset Management Emeritus at Columbia Business School and a leader in thought and in practice in value investing. These two gentlemen together have taught for years an extremely popular course in Columbia University on globalization, so it's great to bring them together. As we have our conversation, remember that you too can be submitting questions, and I'll fold them into the conversation with Bruce and with Joe. So good morning, or afternoon or evening, and from the perspective of others watching, I want to dive right in, if I might. Is globalization dead, Joe?
No, it's clearly not. We have a number of problems that can only be solved by globalization, like climate change. The pandemic was a global problem. And it is still the case that their comparative advantage is important, and global trade is important in raising living standards. So the question is not whether globalization is alive, but how we're going to manage it in the much more complex geopolitics of today's world.
Bruce, what do you think? Looks like we're having a moment of trouble connecting to Bruce. So, Joe, let me follow up on what you said when you said how to manage it. Are you referring to the U.S. China relations, other kinds of global coordination issues? What's most on your mind?
Well, what's most on my mind is the China US issues. There are also global issues having to do with the tech giants, where and the issues of privacy, security that we're also having with Europe. And over the last 4 years, uh, we had our allies, Canada and Europe. I think the latter, our trade relations with Europe, are easily solved. There's a commonality of understanding about what uh, reasonable economics, not perfect, but what reasonable policy is. The issue with China are the ones that are going to be most complex. And even with Europe, the issues over the tech sector are and security are going to be very complex.
Let me press you a bit on the U.S. China front. And I see we now have Bruce. Bruce, do you want to go back and tell me, is globalization dead?
Well, I mean, on what you think globalization is or was. So if you take the view that it was this absolutely overwhelming force, I don't think it was ever alive. And to give you a feel for what that means, when it first became sort of the center of economic discussion, the idea was that every firm was going to be struggling for survival in a global market. Profits were going to go away, and it was just going to be an economic life for businesses that were short, nasty, and brutish. On the other hand, if you look at the period of globalization from roughly 1990 through today, and you look at the profit share of national income in the developed economies, it went up from about 8.5% to about 13%. So, in that sense of this relentless global competition, it never seems to have existed at all. On the other hand, there are clearly sectors that are seriously affected. Manufacturing being one obvious one. But again, you have to be, I think, really careful about where the forces are that are at work. So, on the one hand, you do have globalization, you do have the pressure of imports from places like China, the developing world, that have caused a lot of concern. But on the other hand, if you look at where the manufacturing jobs have gone, they've almost entirely disappeared through productivity growth. So if you go back to the old days when Ross Perot used to talk about the giant sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico, if you actually looked at where those jobs went, 15% of them did go to imports or did disappear to imports. But 85% of those jobs disappeared to productivity growth. So when you look at sort of the advance of manufacturing productivity relative to manufacturing demand, and therefore what is this overwhelming force in the growth of the service sector, which is also, by the way, I think responsible for the profitability. I think that there's an 800-pound sort of long-term technological set of trends that really has gotten a lot of the credit to given a lot of the credit to globalization, it really wasn't necessarily there. And if you look at what's happened today, if you, for example, look at China's trade growth for China is about 2.5% a year and has been since 2011. So I think you've got to be really careful to put these forces in perspective and to look at globalization not as this large, overwhelming force, but in great detail, that there are sectors, there are parts of the population that are greatly affected. But I think if you just take a broad view, you're going to very seriously overstate what's going on, and I think miss a lot of the areas of real concern.
So I want to come back to China, Bruce, but because of your investing fame, I want to ask you, are there any investing themes in where you see globalization playing out in this more dominant role of technological change that you mentioned?
Oh, I think there are two crucial things here. And here I think everybody ought to be aware that the way you make money in investing is by having monopoly power. The way you have monopoly power is that you dominate markets. Big global markets are very difficult to dominate. So if you look at the period literally from 1950 through 1990, where markets really are going global, profits are consistently disappointing for the big global corporations. But if you look at what's happened since then, and as I say, the profits have been much better than expected. I mean, profit share has increased by about 50%. It's because what's happened is that you've got local service markets where goods are locally produced and consumed, and those local service markets are small markets that can be dominated. So a typical example of that is John Deere. John Deere makes equipment. When it was trading that equipment in big global markets, it suffered from the profit pressure of everybody else. But now what it offers is in every locality, it has software that drives smart agricultural machines that are run off GPS satellites. It's entirely local. It has service support. It has financing that's based on local information. And it has local secondhand markets. So if you're now a locality, which is 90% Deere equipment, they have the economies of scale and infrastructure that means that AGCO and Kubota really have no chance of getting into those markets. So I think the way money is going to be made is to understand where you can build local infrastructure that benefits from local economies of scale. And if anybody's looked at the Deere stock price over the last 5 years, you can see the extraordinary power, rather, of that kind of selective local focus.
Okay, great. Thanks for that tip here on Chazen Street Week, I guess. So Joe, let me turn back to you with the China discussion. So sometimes the United States, irrespective of whether it's a Republican or a Democratic president, has the view that China should just look a little bit more like us. Well, that sounds more like a wish list than a strategy. What should U.S. strategy be with respect to China and globalization, realizing China is another major power?
Well, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was Francis Fukuyama wrote this book, The End of History, and he articulated a view that was widely shared at the time that trade would accelerate the convergence. That's why it was called The End of History. Everybody was going to be liberal democracies and free market economies. In retrospect, that was a little bit of a fantasy, although for a while there was a movement in that direction. I think there's a broad consensus that President Xi may represent a deviation, under Wang Zhibao or under his predecessor. There was some movement in that direction, some reason to be optimistic. But at this point, I think there's not much reason to be optimistic. So what that means is I think we should not view trade policy as something likely to accomplish our objective. On the other hand, I think the zero-sum view of the world that was articulated in the previous administration is also wrong. That there are lots of things that we benefit from by addressing together, global problems that could only be addressed together. So I think we have to get over the zero-sum perspective, but we also have to get over the perspective that if we only open up trade, China is going to follow our lead and become a liberal democracy and a market economy. I think we have to get over both of those fallacies. And in that in-between space is where the challenge is going to be. And I think it's not going to be easy as the discussions going on right now in Anchorage are suggesting. There's going to be a lot of posturing. And then the question is, can we go beyond the posturing to find those areas of commonality and recognize that there's going to be conflict?
Yeah, I want to come back to the point you made, Joe, about global public goods and bads. But first, Bruce, ping back to you. U.S. China strategy and globalization, are we on the right path? Do we need to reset?
Well, I think that you have to be really careful. And I think this is one of the things that we emphasize in the course, to understand that local cultures are different. And I'm not a political expert on this, but just in economic terms, there are cultures in which public institutions work really well. And there are other cultures in which public institutions don't work so well. And I think you have to understand that to stand outside a culture and prescribe an economic system for it is not something that's historically worked particularly well. I think you have to have a fairly deep local understanding of local culture. And I'll give you one example of that, which I hope makes people humble about these kinds of interventions and kind of belief in uniform sort of global business practices. If you look at Australia and New Zealand, they both privatized they privatized their telephone utilities. In New Zealand, there was very little effect on the operation. The operation was efficient before the privatization, and it was efficient after the privatization. In Australia, there was an enormous difference, that the public telephone company got much more efficient. Now, who knew that Australia and New Zealand were such different cultures when it came to business organization? So I would just be extremely careful about trying to prescribe global rules for business operations in the face of these really fundamental cultural differences.
Joe, I want to come back to you on
Can I mention
global. Yeah, of course. Jump in.
Uh, yeah, as we try to get global rules, we have to realize that the values differ very greatly. So, for instance, Europeans are putting a lot more emphasis on privacy, and earlier they had put a lot more emphasis on their view of GMOs, whether we agree with their view of GMOs. The fact is, they feel intensely about it. And when you have to develop global rules, when societies have such different views, uh, it's going to be difficult. And we will have to recognize, we can't just simply assume that our values are the ones that ought to predominate. We are going to have to recognize that citizens are in Europe, where they have a democracy, are going to feel very strongly, and we will have to accommodate that.
Well,
Uh, and then differ across the.
yeah, let me pull out that thread, Joe, if I might, about values versus the underlying problems we're trying to solve. So while values may differ, there's some common problems. Going back to the global public goods and bads, climate change comes to mind. The pandemic itself comes to mind. Do we have the right international institutions to bring major blocs together, China, the European Union, United States, Japan, others, to solve those problems?
Well, I think we have some institutions that actually seem to work pretty well. Not, all institutions are imperfect. Human fallibility is part of life, and institutions created by humans are going to be fallible as well. But for instance, I think that the leadership of the IMF, an institution that I've been very critical at times, in trying to respond to the pandemic, was very impressive. They really did change very strongly their focus at the moment on austerity. The EU, which I think behaved very badly in response to the euro crisis, the pandemic changed dramatically and showed a kind of flexibility that I thought was impressive. So, these institutions don't always do exactly what I would recommend, but that's the nature of democratic politics, that different people have different views. But as I looked at the way they responded to the pandemic, I was actually quite impressed.
What do you think, Bruce?
Well, I mean, I take a different view of this. I mean, I think if you look at successes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the ozone layer, there's a big value to decentralized operation there. The history of the Montreal Convention is actually that the ozone hole is identified. The US acts that technology is developed in the United States that replaces the chlorofluorocarbons. And it's only after that that you get the Montreal Convention where everybody can suddenly agree. So that it really was an individual action within one country that worked well. I'll give you another example where I think that there may be certain kinds of societies that respond better than others. I think that if we cannot control global population, we are not going to control global climate. When you look from that perspective, it's actually fairly optimistic. Outside of Africa, fertility rates are essentially between slightly below and significantly below replacement costs. So by the time the end of this century occurs, you should have everywhere else but Africa in the world with declining population. On the other hand, you may have between 4 and 6 million Africans by that time, and there are huge development challenges in that context. Well, I don't know that international institutions are going to be able to develop a consensus on how to deal with that. But China has dealt with population growth in a controversial way, admittedly, but you could imagine that a direct relationship between the Chinese and the African governments built around the Belt and Road Initiative might contribute substantially to the problem of population control in Africa. And I think that waiting for international consensus may actually slow down the effective implementation of programs for encouraging global public goods like population control. So I have a little more laissez-faire attitude towards this, I think, than Joe does.
Well, laissez-faire generally works with me. I'll certainly take that one. But let me go back to an issue that's really at the core of the Chazen Institute's mission about trade. And here I want to take a particular international institution, the World Trade Organization. So, strictly speaking, the way the World Trade Organization defines its criteria for membership and operation, China really doesn't meet those criteria. And this has been part of battles among China, European Union, Japan, the United States for some time. Do we need to reform the WTO in any way? Again, going back to my earlier question, we can't just ask China to be exactly like us. So how do we make the WTO workable and flexible in an environment where there are going to be different economic systems? Joe?
Well, first, I think we have to recognize that the economic model that predominated when the WTO was established. Remember, it was the Uruguay round negotiations that were done under President Bush, and then got the first President Bush, and then got ratified under President Clinton. A set of views of the economy predominated, and that was in this particular period where everybody thought we were going to converge to free market economies. So there was a set of ideas that dominated. I think now we have to recognize that those ideas are not going to be accepted, that China is not going to become a market economy. But we still have gains to trade across different countries, and we need global cooperation, and we have to have rules that work under a more, you might say, heterodox perspective. So that's, it seems to me, the fundamental change that has to occur. Now, organizationally, the what's happened in the last 4 years has shown the fragility of the WTO. If the United States says it's not going to participate, the whole thing comes to a halt. And I think the other countries of the world are coming to the view that that cannot be a way of going forward. There has to be a structure where if one country leaves, even if it's a powerful one, the rest of the world needs to go on with some kind of rules-based system. So I think there's going to have to be some changes in the basically unanimity rules that prevail. There are legal experts who say that they didn't really need those that unanimity, but Europe was afraid to violate, to go beyond that at that moment. So to me, I think it has to go. It still has to be consensus, but not unanimity.
Bruce, what do you think? Unanimity
Well,
rules, other rules?
Well, I think that we're in a period where the rules have been under enormous stress. I mean, I think that everybody's trying to save manufacturing jobs. Given the technological long-term trends that I talked about, nobody's going to succeed. I mean, you hear politicians promise these jobs, and they're just not going to be there, and it's going to be technology more than trade that eliminates it. But I think once they're gone, and they will be gone in 10 to 15 years, maybe 25 years, I think the stress of trying to save those jobs is going to disappear. On the other hand, I think there is a huge problem that the WTO, as it's currently constituted, is not prepared to address. And I think that that really is a larger issue than one of how we can sort of adjust the WTO rules. And it is this: there has been one successful model of development, and it is export-led growth, and that's necessarily been manufacturing-led growth. Well, as manufacturing dies, that model is going away, and you still need development. And I think what you're going to have to start to think about, and whether it's the WTO or some other set of institutions, is how you are going to encourage development in, and I think here again, Africa is the locus of the most concern here, but also certain parts of Latin America. And I think in the absence of a vibrant, growing manufacturing sector, and you can see the rate of growth, very slow rate of growth of manufacturing trade, that's going to be an enormous problem. So I think that it's really that the existing institutional structure is not well adapted to the problems that we're dealing with. And I just am not optimistic that there are alternative structures, unless Joe develops them, that are going to step up to deal with these problems. And I'd like to hear from Joe how he hopes that'll work out.
So quickly, Joe, develop one for us.
First let me say the deficiencies in the current arrangements have been made clear by some of the discussions of the WTO right now on the intellectual property regime. There's a lot of concern about, in the midst of this pandemic, we want to get vaccines available, therapeutics, protective gear available everywhere. It is really a global public good that the pandemic be brought under control everywhere, especially with the mutations going on. And yet, a few countries are refusing to have an emergency adaptation of the intellectual property rules at the WTO for the pandemic. And that just heightens the fact that they're unable to respond quickly. But it's not the WTO the problem is, it's really the individual countries that make up the WTO. And so that's where I share some of the pessimism that Bruce has. Getting global agreements is really hard, and it takes a lot of time. And, we've been aware of climate change now for 30 years, and there has been movement, but it's been very slow. But let me be on the positive, optimistic side. There has been movement.
Let me go to an even bigger problem, if I might. I know our audience is going to think we're all from the dismal science, and I guess we are, but I want to go to a problem that both of you have mentioned and has come up in a couple of audience questions. When I opened the conference this morning, I referred to the fact that old-style globalization took the rules of the game as given and just told the economy to adjust. That kind of approach didn't really endear itself in broad social support for globalization. And so a couple of questions have come in. If you take technological change, which I agree is the larger disruptive force, and globalization together, while they've raised productivity, while they've raised living standards, they've also caused some disruption, and not everyone, of course, is better off. How would you suggest that policymakers could retain more benefits while managing costs? Do you have specific kinds of policies for people who've been left behind, whether it's technological change or globalization? Bruce.
Okay, I think that, again, it's something you've got to think about in detail. The transition to services, forget globalization, is a brutal process. Service jobs are decentralized jobs, which means it's harder to generate productivity in decentralized service institutions than it is in big centralized manufacturing institutions. People tend to work individually, so you get a much broader distribution of income than you do in manufacturing jobs. And frankly, the lower tail of service jobs are just not as well paid as manufacturing jobs. So you've got this enormous transition in the economy to a situation where, independent of globalization, you've got very serious challenges in coping with living standards or adjustments to living standards. I think that that's got to be dealt with on a country by country, institution by institution basis. I think that when you look at disruptive technology, there are industries that have been substantially disrupted, but there are other industries that have not been so substantially disrupted. So again, I think you've got to think about an inventory of where do you intervene in detail. I think just looking at it from a broad perspective is probably not going to do you much good and is going to be contentious and not particularly effective. So that's really, I think, the lesson that individual countries, individual regions, individual industries have got to think about where they're going.
Well, let me take this
Yep, let me
country.
pick up on.
Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just pick up on what Bruce said and probably answer the question you were about to ask. There's a portfolio of things different countries can do, and picking up with what Bruce said, what's appropriate for one country may not be appropriate for other. So, for instance, Sweden has done a really good job of using two instruments. One is called active labor market policies, and the other is industrial policies. And those are policies that help actively move people from one job to another and create new jobs in new sectors. So they've been quite successful in helping restructure the economy. And they did it very explicitly because they, as a small economy, were aware they had to be open. They had to be open to globalization. If they closed themselves off, their standard of living would go down so dramatically. So for them, there was no choice as they viewed it. The United States, one of the things that research has exposed is going back to that simple model that we had 30 years ago, was that labor moved very easily across the country. What we saw in the last, as we looked at the data, that's not true, that there are particular locations that have been very badly affected by globalization. So it's not only particular industries, but also particular parts of the country, and that's had political consequences. And so that means that there needs to be more attention, perhaps, on place-based policies. But in addition to that, I think the United States has to think about redistributive policies that help people share some of the prosperity that we get out of globalization. And I know that we've had previous conversations where both you and Bruce have put a lot of emphasis on the earned income tax credit as a mechanism of both incentivizing people to participate in the labor force. We need lots of jobs. I mean, we need lots of work to be done, climate change, caring for the elderly. There's lots of work that has to be done. And so it makes sense to try to get people into the labor force. But on the other hand, the market hasn't provided livable wages. And this is a policy that brings those two together. I support those. I'm a little bit more concerned about monopsony power in the labor market. And so I also support an increase in the minimum wage.
Okay, quick translation since I write economics textbooks. So monopsony power would be firms using their power to compress wages below market outcome. And Joe had referred to place-based aid, which would be things like federal support for state and local areas. Joe, you mentioned the earned income tax credit. Is there anything more we could be doing to do one of two things, either prepare people for different jobs or reform our social insurance programs that were actually designed for a world we don't particularly live in right now?
Well, as the active labor market policies are what you call the policies that help people move uh, from the jobs that were in the past to the jobs that are new. And that includes training, education, on the job training. In many cases, Bruce is a big supporter of on the job training, and he can explain why. But also helping people move in location, because a lot of the jobs are being created in different places where their jobs are being destroyed. So there's an important role for this kind of active labor market policies. One of the things that our social insurance system was designed for was a world where people lived just a couple of years after retirement. And now people are living much longer. Not all. Some people do die, particularly a lot of people in the blue collar jobs work very hard lives and their life expectancies are short. So the disparity in life expectancies in the United States are very large. And one of the things is that there's the healthier people we like to be, they want to be in the labor force. And I think for our society, it's a good thing to bring them into the labor force. But on the other hand, we have lots of people who are not so healthy. And that's a real challenge in reforming of our social insurance system, Social Security particularly.
Yeah, can I
Bruce.
just say something about that? Because I think that the earned income tax credit has potential that we've really only just begun to tap. So when people think about sort of earned income, they think about 40 hours a week. And I think that's a mistake. I think that if we could get people to work 1,000 hours a year at say $9 an hour, we could, within the scope of the cost of current sort of income support programs, we could give those people who are making $9,000 a year an extra $27,000. And then, of course, it would go away as their incomes increase. And it seems to me that you do want the cohesive effect of people participating in the labor force. And I think even the relatively unhealthy people and the older people, because you want them, and I think there's a lot of evidence that continuing to participate in jobs in the labor force does extend longevity. But, working 20 hours a week, not 40 hours a week, I think is a potential that you want to think about tackling. So I think that there's a lot of adjustment that could be done within the scope of existing structures.
I agree with that. I think you two have identified many good things, both for preparing people for new kinds of jobs and for reconnecting them when things go awry. I want to take us to a different place that I thought about based on what you've both said here. Something at the intersection of technological change and globalization, which is the very big tech firms. Those firms have dominated a lot of industry and have made globalization headlines. And I want to think about a few areas for globalization and global rules in that context. And let me start with competition policy. So, Joe, you mentioned earlier about how the US and Europeans view things differently. Do we need to rethink competition policy, technology, either the United States or Europe? Do we need a global system? What do you think?
Oh, I think we clearly do, and I think there are 2 points here, very broad points. The first is that in the middle of the last century, there was a view that became dominant, that markets are naturally competitive, and there was an undermining through the court of competition law, antitrust law. So the presumption that markets are naturally competitive uh, goes against the things that Bruce talked about earlier, the changes in technology, network externalities, low marginal cost, all the changes in our society and our economy were actually moving us from a world where there was competitive potential to one where the competition was naturally much lower. And the reinterpretation of competition law would have had a problem had there not been the changes in technology, but we would have needed a new competition law just because the world of Standard Oil and the cases that mark the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century are just so different from the technologies of the 21st century. So we clearly need new competition law. Much more difficult. We're going to have to reinterpret,
Bruce, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that the fundamental development that's created the tech companies is the ability of technology to put systems together. So if you look at IBM, IBM did everything. You look at General Motors did everything. General Electric, the same sort of thing with electrical systems. Now you've got a world where Microsoft does only operating systems and related software. Oracle does only database systems and related software. Intel does only CPU chips. Adobe does fonts and graphics. You've got specialized companies that occupy niches and enjoy huge economies of scale. Google does really only search. And once you've got natural monopolies like that, traditional remedies have consistently failed. And so I think what you've got to start thinking about is you're not going to break these companies up. You're going to have a single operating system. You're going to have a single database structure system. You're going to have a single search technology that people are good at and so on. And you're going to have to live with that. And I think the challenge is going to be how can you compensate for the downside of those monopolies? And here, I actually think they may not work so badly economically, especially if you can find some way of taxing the excess profits. But where I think they do work badly is in the information industries, where you have information monopolies with very powerful ideologies. And that is a huge problem. And to be honest, I have no idea what you can do about it. Joe,
No,
this is you again.
Well, that's where I wanted to go next, because another big area for the global tech firms, in addition to competition policy, is social media and privacy concerns. Now, Europe has pushed with GDPR. The U.S. is still trying to find its way. Joe, how do you think about this from a policy perspective?
Well, let me go back for a second. One of the issues, Bruce is right. It's going to be very difficult to break up these things in the way that we broke up Standard Oil or the telephone company. But we are going to have to regulate behavior. That is to say, they have engaged in anti-competitive practices that amplify and extend their market power in areas where it's not necessary. And that results actually in a squelching of innovation. So in some ways, there's a battle going on right now, for instance, among the giants, where Apple, trying to be a defender of individual rights, is saying that it's going to make it easier for users of Apple to set higher privacy standards. Now, the Facebook are really upset about that because they don't want people to be able to set their own privacy standards because what they're doing is taking your data, and that's the key input into their business model. So I think in those areas, and which is related to what Bruce was talking about in information, I think there needs to be government regulation that in that particular case is on the side of Apple. But then one has to make sure that Apple is regulated about using its market power, like in the Apple store, in a somewhat abusive way to get these 30% profits off of everybody who wants to have an app on Apple. So he's going to be regulating the abuse of market power that is going to be the focus, I think, going forward.
Bruce, any thoughts on social media, privacy?
Well, I mean, I love Google. And the problem with Google is it's getting harder and harder to use because there are certain things they don't want you to find out. And there are certain things that they do want you to find out. And I think somehow you've got a set of rules that equalizes the access to information. And I think that applies to social media too. And I think crafting those rules is, sad to say, going to be incredibly difficult and politically very fraught. And I'm not optimistic that we are going to come up with a useful solution. I think it's about more than privacy. I think it's literally about, and I hate to give a shout out to George Orwell, but I think it's about information control. And I think that that's where the regulation has got to go.
Okay, we've had Adam Smith, we've had Hobbes.
Yeah, it's information and it's...
Go ahead, Joe.
No, it's about information and it's about disinformation, and it actually touches on almost every aspect of our society: incitement, hate, and some of the most difficult issues in social organization today. One of the aspects that I should, as just an economist, one of the reasons that we say markets work well is what is called technically the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, where everybody faces the same prices. So you have the marginal valuation of a good the same for everybody. But one of the things that's happening in the new information technologies is that they're having individual specific prices, price discrimination, and that undermines the efficiency of the market and transfers consumer surplus to the tech giants. So it actually really goes to the heart of what makes a market economy works.
So one thing I will say about social media and privacy, feel free to keep the tweets coming about the conference. I see those are nice. Gentlemen, before I do a couple of lightning round questions that from our audience, I want to go to the class you're teaching and have taught for a long time at Columbia Business School. When you teach globalization, what are your goals for the students as future business leaders? What are you up to, Bruce?
Okay, well, I'll say I think there are two lessons we really try, or I really try and enforce in the business part of the course. The first is that in a global world, you need a really well-crafted local geographic strategy. And that applies to product space, where you're thinking of niche products, as well as to physical geography. The second thing is you better know what your people are doing, whether it's local or global. So the classic case that I hope my students never get trapped in is there is a company in Germany that is historically been reasonably well run. They're the leading car wash machine manufacturer in the world. And the head of that company thinks it's all about manufacturing. But when you look at what his people do, he has 1,800 employees. 200 of them deal with overhead. 350 of them manufacture and design stuff. And 1,250 of them service the systems on a decentralized local basis. And if you think you are a centralized global manufacturing company as opposed to a collection of local service operations in that world, you are heading for trouble. And so I think it's understanding the local structure of activity in this increasingly global world.
Okay, local meets global. Joe, what do you think? What's the big thing students should take from the class?
Well, part of it is that business operates in a political environment with rules set by governments and internationally. And the international dimension of globalization, the policy dimension of globalization, uh, along the lines that we've discussed for the last hour, are among the issues. The complexity of trade rules, rules on global finance, rules on intellectual property, the international public goods of environment and health. These are all things that we try to bring out in the course. And that international dimension is shaping the business environment in one way or another everywhere.
I should say that for everybody who's watching this, we'll be sending you information about what these two great economists are doing in that class. I think we'll have time for maybe one quick lightning round. You've talked about waves of growth and globalization. Looking forward, who are the next tigers? What economies in the world should we be looking for as the vanguard, the new success stories in globalization, Joe?
Well, I've always been a great admirer of small countries that are able to go into addressing certain issues. And we've seen how a few small countries have done very well in the pandemic. Of course, they tend to be islands, and so they can be more isolated, but they get more social cohesion. And so the response of New Zealand, Taiwan, to the pandemic has been very impressive and has energized these two places. And it'll be interesting to see whether they can capitalize on that going forward and use that to get niches. They won't be the dominant firms in the world, but they will find niches that will be able to raise the living standards of their citizens.
Bruce, what do you think?
Okay, the coming industries are going to be service industries, medical care, education, and the heart of those industries is going to be human resources. And I think the economies that are best at attracting global human resources are the ones that are going to do really well. And at the moment, if you look around, the country that is most receptive to recruiting smart foreigners and most successful at it is the United States. So I'm actually reasonably optimistic that in many crucial industries where we are already leaders, like high-end education, it is the United States that's going to be the tiger, especially if we can successfully decentralize and get the benefits of small, cohesive political units in the way Joe talked about Sweden and the island economies.
So we got small countries, we've got services, we've got tips all around. Thanks so much to Bruce Greenwald, to Joe Stiglitz for a very stimulating conversation. At the Chazen Institute, we participate in this, trying to encourage faculty research in these areas all the time. And Bruce and Joe have really brought it to life in class. So thank you very, very much.